Hi, I'm Eric White. Today I'm going to show you how to create an external content type that gets its data from OData. This is the project that is associated with an MSDN article on creating an external content type using OData. I'm going to walk through the process of creating the project that I describe in that article. So first thing I'm going to do is create a plain old ordinary SharePoint list, and it's going to have a customer ID and a customer name and an age as columns in that list. And I'm going to be quiet and speed up this process. You probably have done this about 1,000,000 times. I'm going to do it quickly so that you don't have to sit through the laborious process of watching me create that list. Okay, now I've got a SharePoint list. It has 3 columns: customer ID, customer name, and age. The next thing I'm going to do is create a Visual Studio project. This project is going to be a SharePoint 2010 project. It's going to be a business data connectivity model project. I'm going to use .NET Framework 3.5 because that's the version that is supported with SharePoint 2010. My location is where I want it, but I'm going to change the name of the project to Contoso. And the reason I'm changing it to Contoso is that the name of the project becomes the high order portion of the namespace that is going to be generated for the classes that we're going to be generating in this process. So if you're building external content types to a customer relationship management system, you might want to use Contoso.crm for the namespace, and then customer would be the entity name. That's the strategy I'm going to take here, so click OK. Then the wizard comes up. It asks what local site do you want to use for debugging. I'm running on the IW demo virtual machine, so it's correctly set to intranet.contoso.com. You'll change this value if you need to for your own intranet or for your own SharePoint site. And also I'm going to deploy as a farm solution. That is the only option. You cannot create an external content type assembly connector and deploy that as a sandbox solution. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rename the BDC model just for neatness' sake. I'm going to rename it Contoso BDC Model. Next, I'm going to go over into the design panel for BDC and click on the entity. I'm going to rename this as customer, and the namespace is going to be contoso.crm. One of the things you have to do is you have to specify what identifiers you're going to have for the particular entity. I'm going to change identifier 1. I'm going to change it to customer ID. System.string is fine. Now I'm going to open the BDC Explorer. Same thing, I'm going to rename BDC Model here as Contoso BDC Model. One thing that's interesting about the BDC Explorer is that you can only rename the nodes down in the property pane, unlike in the Solution Explorer where you can rename nodes directly in the tree control. Here is my entity, customer, and it automatically defined two methods, the finder and the specific finder. The finder is the read list, the specific finder is read item. I'm going to leave those just because it eases our way when we're defining the return parameter for read list. It makes it easier for me to explain what's going on. But the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to change this read item, I'm going to change that name to read customer. And as long as I'm at it, I'm going to change read list to read customer list. Going back up to read customer, this is the specific finder. It takes an identifier as a parameter, but I'd rather have it, the parameter name not be ID, I'd rather have it be customer ID. And using the guidelines of the .NET framework, I'm going to name the parameter starting with a lowercase letter. You name parameters starting with a lowercase letter, you name types starting with an uppercase letter, and use appropriate camel casing. Identifier 1, I am going to change that to customer ID. You'll notice something is if we come down here, the identifier field is automatically set to customer ID. That got set when we changed the identifiers in the entity and specified that customer ID was the identifier for this particular entity. Read customer returns an entity. It returns the customer. So what let's do is let's rename entity 1 and rename it to customer. And of course, coming right down here, the type name is not Contoso.Bdc Model 1, it's Contoso.crm, and instead of entity 1, it is customer. So the type name is Contoso.crm.customer, and that's what we want. That's a good type name for our situation here. Now I need to set up the type descriptors for the customer entity. So I'm going to reuse these two fields, identifier 1 and message, which were automatically generated for me by Visual Studio. But so I'm going to take identifier 1, and this is really customer ID. Now I'm going to rename the message property and call it customer name. And the type is system.string, and that's fine. And I'm going to add one more type descriptor. This type descriptor is going to be age, and I'm going to give it a type of int32. One more thing that we need to do here is that the entity that is returned by read customer needs to have its identifier set to read only. So now we have entity customer, we have age, customer ID, which is read only, and customer name. And so at this point, read customer is set up exactly as we want it. Now let's work on read customer list. Read customer list returns one value, which is a collection, and it's an entity list here. Instead of entity list, I'm going to change its name to customer list. To set the type name for this customer list, I'm going to do something where I'm going to drag this window up here so that we can see more. And you can see the type name set for the customer list is system.collections.generic.IEnumerable _1, and then there's a type name in double square brackets. That _1 syntax, that is the indication that IEnumerable is a generic type, and it has one generic parameter or one type parameter, and that one type parameter is what's in the square brackets. We can see it's Contoso.Bdc Model 1, and that's not correct, and we want to change that to Contoso.crm, and instead of entity 1, it's customer. The convention also includes a comma followed by the Bdc model that type is found in, and that's correctly set to Contoso Bdc model. So I am going to put the properties window right back down there, and customer list returns a collection of customers. as it generated the default model, it put this entity1 and identifier message in there. We don't want those. Actually, what we want to do is we want to take this customer entity right there and paste it in there, because that has exactly what we want, and then we don't want that entity1. So now we have read customer list. It's defined exactly as it should be, and read customer is defined exactly as it should be. So now let's add some more methods. We need to add 3 more methods. The first new method is, let's do the delete next. So delete customer. And delete customer is a simple method that takes a customer ID as a parameter and it returns void. So the first thing that you do when you define a new method is to specify the method instance name and specify the method instance type. The method instance name, we just really want to call it delete customer. That makes it consistent with the way that read customer and read customer list were declared up above. And the type of this, it's not a finder, it's a deleter. So this tells BCS the purpose of this method, and basically tells BCS that it can call this method to delete one of those entities in our external content type. And I need to add that customer ID parameter. So I'm going to create a parameter, and I'm not going to name it parameter, I'm going to name it customer ID, starting with lowercase as is appropriate. And here's the customer type. By default, it assigns it a name of customer ID type descriptor, and really we just need it to be customer ID, and we can go get one of those right here. So we can copy that customer ID and come over here and paste it in here, and it'll tell me the parameter already has a type descriptor. Do you want to replace it? Yes. So now delete customer is correctly configured. Let's add a new one for update customer. So let's add a new method. First thing that we do after we add a new method is come down here and specify the instances. The instance name, and the instance name will be customer, update customer. And this is not a finder, this is an updater. So now we've defined the method instance name and its type. It takes the customer entity as a parameter. So let's create a parameter, and we're going to call this customer. It's an in parameter right there, so that's all good. And once again, it puts a default type descriptor in there. We don't want that type descriptor. We really want a customer. So let's copy that and paste that there. Replace. And a couple of things that are different with this particular entity. First of all, we do not want the identifier to be read-only, because the user is actually allowed to change the identifier when the user is modifying an item in that list. So we make it not be read-only. And second of all is we have to come into each of the fields for this entity and specify true for updater field. And this tells BCS that these are fields that should be retrieved or allowed the user to enter those fields when we are updating those fields. So we've now created our entity customer, which is a parameter to update customer. And we're done defining update customer. And last, we need to add create customer. And as usual, the first thing that we do is change the finder instance name to create customer, and we change its type to a creator. Now I'm going to create the parameters for create customer. There are two parameters. One is the customer going in, and the other is the customer going out, the customer that we've created. In this particular situation, we can use the same one. I'll show you what I mean by that. But we need to declare two parameters. One's an in parameter and one's an out parameter. So I'm going to tell it create a parameter. And the parameter is an in parameter, and I'm going to call it, this is customer. And again, I'm going to create another parameter. One thing to notice is when you're operating on the BDC model, sometimes this list for the BDC method details jumps around a bit. So you want to make sure before you start adding parameters that you're actually adding them in the right place. I've made that mistake a couple of times where it jumped around and I added the second parameter to the update customer method, which of course isn't what's supposed to happen. So I'm adding a parameter to the create customer method, and this parameter I'm going to call it returned customer. And the parameter direction here, it's an out parameter. And you can see over here by default it added a customer type descriptor and returned customer type descriptor. That's not what we want at all. We'll just again come down here to read customer, the return parameter, and we'll copy that customer entity. And on the create customer, let's paste that in there and let it replace it. And also we'll just paste it in on the return customer. And there are a couple of interesting things here. The customer that comes in, customer ID needs to be not read only, because it's passing in a type where all of those values may be set. So customer ID can't be read only in the type that is being passed in. Second thing we have to do is, in a parallel way to updaters, is we have to set the creator field to true for all three properties in this entity. However, the return customer is just fine the way it was when I copied it from the read customer. This one's true. That's an int32. That's customer name. So at this point, I've defined 5 methods for my customer entity. I've set up the parameters for all of those 5 methods. Let's just save that model. Next thing I'm going to do is we're going to rename this to customer. This is where our customer entity is going to go. Let's view the code for customer. And what I have over here, I have customer.cs. This is the code that accompanies the MSDN magazine article. So I'm just going to copy all of that code and paste it in there. It's a contoso.crm namespace. It's a class called customer. It has 3 properties in it. We'll save that and close that. And let's open customer service. And in customer service, I'm going to copy that from my code from the article and paste that in for customer service. So now I have my C# code set up as I want it. I also have my model set up as I want it. You'll notice that I'm still getting an error, a not resolved error for team site data context, and that's because I haven't added the service reference for my OData data source. So I'm going to go up here on the references and I'm going to add a service reference. Because I'm working on the IW demo virtual machine, my address is http://intranet.contoso.com/bin/listdata.svc. The last part of that, the _VTI under bin, that's the well-known endpoint for an OData data source on a SharePoint site. I'll tell it to go to retrieve the metadata for that list data service. It found the metadata and returned it. And I'm going to change the namespace to CRM because that's the convention that I'm using in this sample application. So click OK. It resolves those references for that code. There's one more thing that we have to do here before we can deploy this is I'm going to come over here in feature1.template.xml and I have to set the site URL property. This is the URL of the SharePoint site. Build Contoso, build succeeded. Let's just give a try and deploy it and see how this works. Deploy started, adding solution, activating features, and deploy succeeded. So we can go and see that the deploy succeeded by going into the external content type viewer in SharePoint Central Administration. Just to show you, I'm just going to go ahead and close that and start SharePoint Central Administration. You go to Manage Service Applications, go to Business Data Connectivity Service, and there we can see our entity that we just defined and checked into the system. And of course, the first thing we have to do is set permissions so that we have a way that So now we've added all authenticated users to have permission for this external content type. All authenticated users have edit, execute, selectable, and set permissions. So click OK. Next, let's just go back over here and let's create an external list and see if our data shows up. So let's create an external list. Let's call it customers ext and use our external content type browser and select our external content type that we've built and click create. And there is a list that has 3 records in it, and if I come over here and there's the list inside SharePoint and there's the external list. Well, let's try a couple of things. Let's try editing an item. And let's say this is Raymond III, and save that. And our customer name has changed. Well, let's say that Raymond has decided he doesn't want to be in our database. Delete that item. Our deleter worked just fine too. Let's go over to items and add a new item. So let's add Jill 66. Her name is Jillian. And she is 35. And Jill 66 has been added. Her age is 35. And if we go back here and look at the SharePoint list, you can see that the data in the two are being kept in sync. And we could even add a new item here. And we added George 99. If we come over to the external list and we see George 99. We just created an external content type from scratch. It's a BCS assembly connector content type. We connected that up through OData to another SharePoint list on the same SharePoint site. Now, of course, in the real world, you'll be connecting out to OData sources, or you'll be replacing the OData code with code to go attached to whatever interesting data source you have. This gives you a good place to start from for creating an external content type that is implemented using a BCS assembly connector. Thanks for watching.